Canadian Public Accountability Board is part of the International Regulators IFIR. We had our annual conference in Ottawa earlier this year, and the topic of the meeting was disruption. But what was happening in the profession, and automation forms part of that. There's other factors as well. So I'll touch on that a little bit. By the way, I really appreciate the various discussions we've had today. I thought they were fascinating. They feed into a lot about what we're thinking about at CPAB. So thank you so much for inviting me to this. I really do appreciate that. Just by way of background, I've been with CPAB now for 6 months. And so I've learned a lot. I did come from one of the big global firms. We can have a debate about that afterwards. And I have been auditing for 30 years, a partner for 20 years there. So certainly have a good understanding of the profession, the auditing side of the profession. I also was a corporate controller in industry, and I was a CFO along the way. So I also have a perspective on the preparer side and maybe an empathy as well for the preparer side. So now being a regulator, it's quite different for me and a bit of an adjustment as we go along. When I was a partner at the firm, had gone through 4 CPAB inspections and 1 PCOB one. And I went through all that fear that we do as partners of what it's like to have somebody come in and criticize the work that you're doing. And you go through the process of going, geez, like, did I miss something significant? And like, did I get that document in the file? Because if you can't evidence something in your file, it really, in effect, you have not done those procedures. And now studying it from the other side and thinking about some of these sort of macro trends which are occurring, and really thinking about our role as a regulator, about the role, the discussion that we had right from the start of, right, how do we create, how do we act in the public interest? How do we protect the interest of the investing public? And that gets complicated because in terms of understanding what the definition, et cetera, of it is. So I'll just touch really today on a couple of things related to this. What are we doing? We're assessing risks on a regular basis. I don't think my time's up yet, is it? We look at places in our inspections and analyze root causes of what has gone wrong. What is really the reason that an item has been missed in an audit? And that's related to our inspections. We're not looking into the root causes of what's gone wrong on, for example, frauds, but it's certainly an area of high interest to us. What causes a poor quality audit? And by the way, what is a poor quality audit as you go through that as well? We require firms to remediate what we view as quality issues. And we also spend quite a bit of time engaging with company directors, particularly audit committee members, other regulators, standard setters, all with the viewpoint of increasing quality. And we do believe that audit quality is a three-legged stool in the sense of you have the auditors, but you also have the preparers, the company, and the audit committee who play a critical role in that ecosystem. And we believe, based on our blunt way of measuring it, that audit quality in Canada has improved over the last 15 years. If I look at the road ahead, though, and what's happening, I do agree that there's massive technological change coming forward, and I think maybe you'll speak to that as well a bit. But even at the point in time 6 months ago, when I was still working in a firm, I was applying the earlier stages of artificial intelligence, and the firm was certainly deploying artificial intelligence technologies. It will go to the next phases. It has to, because you're right. They are very, very concerned about other organizations coming in and taking over that, being able to take big data and analyze that and perform many functions in the audit in a very, very different way. I was to the same point around capital. We were taking certain files and be able to re-perform 100% of the work in certain areas. And hopefully those aren't the areas where you actually need to go and talk face-to-face to somebody, but You could take the number of hours on items that were sort of very, very big data related and significantly reduce it, but there was a large investment in technology. And I don't think the industry has figured out how to sort of regain that investment. In fact, you'd often have to go to the audit committee and sort of explain why your number of hours have gone down, and they're worried about maybe you're not spending the right amount of time. But I think the disruptors will be enabling, and if done in the right way, can be utilized in such that you do create a stronger audit overall, and you reduce the risk of things being missed along there. It's going to require a different skill set, and that's one of the things that's going to be changing in the profession, is those IT skills are becoming increasingly important for the people who are coming through. And all of us have to increase our knowledge of how IT is utilized, and that includes us as regulators. And that's a challenge. We're a 50-person organization in Canada. Are trying to understand technology which is being developed by large global firms and developed globally on this is going to be extremely difficult, because we don't have the data scientists in our organization, the IT specialists to be able to do this. We're going to require collaboration, work with our international regulators, hiring, of course, consultants to be able to really understand whether the artificial intelligence is truly intelligent. Can we rely on a black box? And we can't rely necessarily on that black box. We have to be doing our job as a regulator to ensure that there is a properly tested system and that it's operating effectively. There's emerging businesses which are happening out there, and something that, the future, I think they seem to be coming up at an ever increasing pace. So blockchain, right? And what is blockchain going to do to the profession overall? Is it truly going to take away, I've heard some numbers thrown around, a third of the accounting jobs over the next while. I don't know. There's different scenarios at how it could roll out. What we're seeing right now is that early stages where some organizations are in denial about what's occurring. Some of them are confused. Others are trying to be early adopters of the technology. So for example, in the crypto area, we now have 50 public companies, approximately that, right, Angelo, who are operating in Canada. Now, for those 50 public companies, the audit approach on some of those is really difficult to figure out because we don't have what we traditionally rely on for auditing. We don't have that custodian, that person you can send a confirmation to verify that an asset actually exists. How do you know that an individual has the right and ownership to something which is an encryption key? And what will be required to audit that? And so we have a situation in Canada right now that 3 of the 4 big 4 firms have effectively indicated that at the moment they're not ready to do an audit opinion on these companies, on those 50 companies. So then you have a situation of who is doing the audit work and what skill sets have they acquired, and are the existing audit standards sufficient? Can you rely on those, or do you have to have different standards which are in place? So those are the types of things which are both very interesting but are a challenge for us in Canada, but probably also internationally as well. The other big area, if I put aside technology for a second, because you go on about technology for a long time, is public trust. And I think it was referred to early today, the issues in Europe and let's say South Africa with respect to trust in the profession. And at the same IFIR conference that we were attending, we had each of the CEOs of the largest 6 accounting firms speak, and every one of them spoke using sometimes slightly different words about trust and integrity. And one of them said trust has never been lower in the profession. Now, part of that comes from what's happening in Europe, and the idea, and whether it's an expectation gap or not, that auditors are responsible for not detecting failures. And that might have been in the 2 big classification of failures are failure because of a massive fraud or failure because a company goes under and there wasn't the ability to predict through a going concern note that they were going to go under in the next year. And so those are areas in the UK and the US that the standard setters are examining again to see if is the standard good enough but it may not be the standards as well. It may be the procedures that are performed, or it may be back to what is the expectation of the public. I love the examples that you provided in terms of the fraud discussion today. I think it's fascinating. I reflect on that a lot, partially because of the role I'm in, and what can we require, or what could auditors do more in the way of fraud. And I was thinking about it today as I was driving in, and Jeremy and I were chatting, and my son is now, well, he does work. He's worked for the last few years for Canada Border Security Agency, and what you do at Canada Border Security is you're trying to figure out if somebody's lying to you when they're coming across the border. And when they start off, they go away for 4 months to Rigaud, Quebec, and get trained in a number of things, but one of the big areas is, how do you ask questions? How do you investigate? What do you do? And what's the law associated with that? They also learn how to use guns, and I'm not suggesting that for our profession right now. But you know, the interesting thing is we reflect on our staff, and I reflect on the teams that I worked with. Yes, the junior staff are trained in areas of fraud and professional skepticism, but is it enough? And I'm not suggesting it's necessarily at the university level. It's a combination of university and what you do within the firms as you're being trained. But I do agree with the comment that was made that there's probably a mixture of sort of nature and nurture, and the education element definitely comes into ability to be professionally skeptical. I also agree with the point of view that was made around, with the use of technology these days, is that actually harder to detect at times fraud. So a couple of examples. I found 2 frauds in my first year as a staff member at the firm. I think that was maybe a little bit of luck along the way. Neither of them I don't think you would find these days. First one was related to endorsing checks. And when I flipped over the checks, they were all endorsed over to the leader, the guy who was running the program. It was a government entity I was working for at the time. It's all financial, and transactions are not done and endorsed in that manner anymore. The second one was payroll. And it was sort of strange because you're out there auditing an organization, you start to go, well, where are all these people? There's supposed to be one office. And there's this big long list of payroll, and they weren't actually consultants and all that. And it ends up that they were using as a conduit to pay a number of people from a foreign country. But you don't get that unless you're actually physically out there. We're in the auditing profession taking many of what would be considered as the easier areas to audit these days and putting them in centers of excellence. Somewhere else in the country, some in another country. So those individuals working on that work aren't interacting face-to-face with the team members, aren't seeing the organization as much. I think the firms are thinking about that and are aware of that, but I do view it as a caution. I was involved in one file where I had the unfortunate situation where I had to go to deposition. And I wasn't actually, our file wasn't the one was being named in it, so we were in a way being brought forward as a witness related to it. But fascinating when you take your whole audit file and you do what you're saying, you take all the emails that every staff member had and print them all out and put them in a file, and I had to review them to be prepared to be deposed. And I was actually a little shocked in a couple of the areas. Take the fraud inquiries that we do in the firm. I would have, as the partner on it, gone and spoken with the CEO and the CFO. And of course, those are really, what are you going to do? The CFO and the CEO are going to tell you that, well, there may be of this small things, but you don't usually find anything through the discussion with them. The junior staff may. And what I found is that my junior staff, instead of going and holding the meetings, had actually sent an email saying, were there any frauds? If they had actually picked up on that and it was a case of fraud, we would have been sunk on that long because we actually weren't complying with the professional standards, let alone, but what they did is they then completed a checklist in the file and said, yes, we talked to the following people. But the evidence outside of the file did not support that. So back to the point around, there's a lot of junior people working on the audits in the first few years, and then it's something that we at CPAB do worry about and think about, is whether that can have a contributing factor to some of the failures that I was referring to. Foreign jurisdictions as well is something that we think about. And that was mentioned just because the data and the studies have all shown that in certain of the jurisdictions, the audit quality is nowhere near as strong at the moment. And in Canada, a lot of the public companies do have significant subsidiaries in foreign jurisdictions, and even our ability to get access to those files can be somewhat limited. So a lot happening. I think there are a number of areas where, you'd challenge me with, where do researchers fit in? And as I talk about these topics, whether it is fraud, whether there is a correlation between level of training and actual ability to apply professional skepticism, looking at what's happening on a worldwide basis and on different topics, looking at the whole area of technology deployment, all of those are potential areas for additional research. And by the way, I have not spent the time looking at what research there is already being performed on an international basis. I do think that the next generation audit, by the way, I may have talked about some negatives, it has a lot of potential to be a lot stronger as we move forward. And I think what we're seeing with the large firms and many of the firms these days of a centralization, increased controls, processes that may not be referred to in that book, but we're definitely seeing it as regulators will strengthen what's happening in the auditing profession. So it is an interesting time, but we have, I think it holds a lot of promise as we go forward. And by the way, if you are interested, CPAB, our inspection results and all that are on our website, and we'll be coming out with our strategic plan as well for the next few years on our website later on this fall. Thank you.